My name is Kyle Royer.
Oh, it's hot. It's really hot.
And I'm making my second ever sword named Excelsior. So let's embark together on this epic edged adventure. In this video, we're gonna find out if Kevin the Minion Forge is truly with us because I'm heat treating Excelsior. I'm super on edge right now because this is the final stage to where the sword could be destroyed. I've spent 2 weeks working on this thing so far. There's things that could happen out of my control and cause me to have to restart. With my first sword that I made a year ago, the blade didn't get destroyed during heat treat, but it did get way overheated when we went to harden it up and we had to go back and do all of our normalization cycles all over again.
1750. 1750.
1750. That is really bad. We're done. It could have gone much worse, and I'm hoping this time will go much better. Kevin the Forge is back up to temperature. We're right up around 1550 degrees, and our blade is cooled off. It's time to put it in the forge, heat it up, and then we're gonna quench it in Parks 50. We've got a big old long tube so we can fit the entire sword in there and get it hardened up. This is the make or break it stage. Right now our blade is perfectly good. It's got some minor warps in it or whatever that I can deal with, but there's nothing like catastrophic wrong with it. This is where it all comes down to the wire though, and we could end up cracking the blade or not hardening it properly, or something right now could make it so we have to restart on this blade. All right, you ready? Yep. Our blade's been soaking at 1550 degrees for a few minutes now. We're finally ready. It's the moment of truth. I'm gonna pull it out, get it into the Parks oil as quickly as possible, and I'm gonna violently try to move it up and down to help break that vapor barrier and get it to quench nice and quickly. We want it to quench at about 1500 degrees. The reason I took it up to 1550 is because when you take it out and then in between the time of it being out in the air and getting into the oil, it's probably gonna cool down a little bit. So that's why I like to go just a little bit over what I'm actually shooting for. Shaking a little bit here. Oh boy. Get a really good hold on it. Just trying to go straight up and down with it. Almost the whole thing fits in there. The end of the tang doesn't quite fit, it looks like, but that's okay. I like to normally straighten my blades a little bit while they're still hot, but with this one, I really just want to make sure it's cooled down a lot before I take it out. Oh, it's warped. It's warped quite a bit. Quite a bit of warpage. So I was expecting it to warp. It was actually pretty warped before I even put it in. All the surface grinding and stuff had it pretty warped, but it definitely warped about twice as much as it was. It looks to be pretty even down the blade though, and that's good at least. It doesn't look like it's all in one spot. We can run over it with a file a little bit and see if the edge is at least hard. It's hard. Oh. I lightly went over the blade with the surface grinder just to remove all the scale and nasty stuff on here because I want to be able to easily see the colors that we get on the blade when I go to temper it. Dad's been getting Kevin converted over to electric instead of propane to do the tempering. And even though we have a bunch of thermocouplers in there, I also want to go by the color. So we're going to go by the thermocouplers, the electric coils they're putting out, and we're going to confirm that we're getting the right temper by looking at the color. We're going for kind of a straw to kind of a bronzy color as far as what I want to see when we pull this blade out. I also de-oiled the blade with acetone on a paper towel and wiped the blade down really well. Because if you have oil on your blade, then a lot of times the color will end up a lot darker and it'll give you a false negative as far as the color you're looking for.
Really good.
Coils are glowing. It looks like the forge is on in there. Like it's bright orange.
Yeah, it's not that hot. I mean, you gotta let, yeah.
The next day.
We finished tempering the sword. The only thing is the tempering oven gets slightly hotter than what the thermocouplers are saying. So we got a little bit of an area that overheated a little bit. It's got a little bit of a blue color. I'm okay with like a bronze and maybe a little bit of purple, but the blue isn't okay. So we're gonna have to reheat treat this sword because I want it to be as good as I can get it. So we've got Kevin heating back up to 1525 to 1550 degrees, and we're gonna re-harden this and then clean the scale off and re-temper it. The only thing we're gonna do different is Dad set the coils up a little bit differently in Kevin to spread out the heat more evenly. And we're also going to lower the temperature a little bit because I think the way the PID is set up, it gets a little bit hotter than what the thermocouple is reading. So we're gonna lower the temperature by maybe 30, 40 degrees, do some tempering, pull the blade out, see how the colors are looking, and then make some little adjustments from there.
You got that metal rod, Dad?
Yep.
Got the sword heated up to about 1525 degrees. We've got our Parks 50 oil ready. We're gonna do our quench for the second time. Should be good and hard again. I'm just gonna leave it in here till it's nice and cool and we'll wipe it off and then check it. The blade hardened up nicely. I checked it all the way down the length of the blade and I didn't see any soft spots anywhere. It looks really good. It actually came out a little straighter than the first time we heat treated it. There's a little less warpage in it. The entire blade still has warpage and it's kind of like fishtailing both directions, but before there was like one that was really bad, like an extreme warp. Now it's just a bunch of little warps, so I'm happy about that for sure. We need to lightly surface grind the blade, get Kevin cooled down, get him switched over to electric, and try to temper again at a lower temperature.
One eternity later.
I finished tempering the sword for the second time and it came out really, really well. Had a nice, even, beautiful bronzy color covering the whole blade. Super even. I had to temper the majority of the blade in the oven and then lift it up a little bit in order to get that last little bit because the bottom of the oven's a little cool. So to get the tip area tempered the same as the rest of the blade, I just lifted it up about 2 feet and held it up there with a clamp and let the tip area reach the same temper as the rest of the blade. I also lightly surface ground the blade just to get it cleaned up a little bit, and now is the time to start straightening the blade. So because of that, I'm gonna do a cycle of straightening, some surface grinding, some straightening, and we'll just keep working it down and slowly get it thinner and more of our finished blade thickness before we start working on the fuller and finishing up the profile and all that other stuff. I'm gonna straighten the blade by clamping it in the vise and heating up the center of the blade, being careful not to heat up the edges of the blade because we don't want to take out the temper, but it's okay if we over temper the center of the blade. I'll take the torch and put some localized heat in one little area, then I'll pull the blade over whichever direction I need to go in, and then we'll cool the blade off. And I'll take it back over to my granite slab and check and see how straight I've gotten it, and then slowly work the warps out of the blade. It wouldn't be a big deal if there was just one warp, but there's multiple warps going in different directions, so it's gonna be really tricky. Excelsior is looking really good. I was actually able to get her nice and straight without too much effort. I know on my first sword, it took me forever to get it straightened out. The warpage on Excelsior was really bad too. It's not like the warpage was a lot better than the first sword. It actually had 4 main warps in the blade plus the tang. The blade was warped one way, the other way, and then back the other way. The next thing we need to do on The next thing we need to do is take a coffee break. The next thing we need to do is take a coffee break. I'm trying to grab it without looking.
To do it, but then you stop.
Trying to grab it without looking. The next thing we need to do is take a coffee break. Very important. Caffeinated. Now actually the next thing we need to do is get the blade profiled. We roughed it in before, but it's time to fine tune it. We've got quite a bit of material to remove at the tip. We need to get the entire blade symmetrical on each side. We also have a lot of material to remove around the ricasso area. We need to really get those cool curves all ground in and make it symmetrical. Want both sides perfectly as close to being symmetrical as I can get them. Here it is, we've got Excelsior profiled. It's really starting to look like my sketch now, and it's kind of exciting, especially since I got the ricasso area profiled. It's starting to bring it all together instead of this just being a big, like, massive leftover steel down here. I'm loving the shape of this thing. It's gonna be so cool. Getting the sword symmetrical was kind of difficult, so why don't you come over here and I'll kind of show you what my process was in order to make sure both sides of the sword were symmetrical to the other side. So the first thing I did to get the profile cleaned up, at least on the main portion of the sword, was to use this pattern I made out of a piece of 15 and 20 steel. The profile of the pattern is really good, especially this main section through here. The big changes being down here at the tip. The sword ended up coming out about 1 inch longer than what my pattern was, so I kind of had to fake a small area in down here. I didn't want to take the time to make a whole new pattern because that would have taken me at least an hour or two, maybe 3, to make a really good pattern. What I did was clamped this onto the blade on both ends, and then I ran down it with a scribe and gave myself a really good scribe line. And I also scribed the back side of the pattern. And then I just flipped it over, lined it up on the end of the tang perfectly the same, and then scribed on this side as well. That got me the majority of this profile squared in really nicely. But the tip is another story. Since the tip was kind of faked in, I had to kind of just eyeball it at first. But in order to make sure it's perfectly symmetrical, what I did was put it on a long piece of paper and then take a pencil and draw right up against the sword all the way down. Give myself a really good solid line on both sides. And then to make sure that the blade is symmetrical, since I kind of faked the end out here, I faked it in. You just flip the sword over after you've drawn around it, line it back up on the pencil mark, and then if it's nice and symmetrical, it should line up with the pencil mark on each side perfectly. If it's not symmetrical, after you flip it over, you'll end up with like a little gap where it doesn't fill in the pencil area on one side, and the other side will probably cover the pencil area. So you'll know you'll need to grind a little bit off of one side or the other in order to get it symmetric. For the ricasso area, I also used the pattern to get that really close. So I cleaned up my pattern a little bit, got this ricasso area looking really good. I ended up making it a little bit more swoopy than I had originally planned. I kind of took a little bit more out of this area. Then I clamped it to the blade and scribed around the ricasso area, flipped it over, and did the same thing on the other side. Then I went ahead and shaped all that down, and that got me really, really close, but it wasn't quite perfect. So once again, I just used the pencil and paper trick. Draw around the blade, and draw around the ricasso. And then when you flip it over, it should perfectly match the lines from the other side. If it doesn't match, that means you gotta remove some material somewhere in order to get both sides symmetrical. It took me a few attempts to get everything symmetric. I just kept bringing it back to the paper, doing a little bit of grinding if I needed to, and then go back to the paper again. It took me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like 5 attempts to get the blade symmetrical. And then it took me a full-blown 10 attempts to get the ricasso area fully symmetrical on each side. In the next video, we're gonna start working on our fuller, otherwise known as a blood groove. This thing is gonna have a massive one all the way down the center of the blade, so we gotta do some layout and then we'll start grinding and sanding it before we start grinding on the blade bevels themselves. I will see you in the next video. May the forge be with you. Bye-bye!